When Colonel Morrison barked, "Any jet will do," into his radio that scorching July afternoon, he never imagined that the first aircraft to respond would be piloted by the one person he'd spent 2 years trying to keep out of combat missions. Captain Constance Garcia had been watching from the maintenance hangar when the emergency call went out. Her A-10 Thunderbolt II fueled and ready despite being officially grounded for routine inspections. What happened next would shatter every assumption about who belonged in the cockpit when lives hung in the balance, and transform a young woman who'd been dismissed as too emotional for combat into the pilot who had redefined what courage looked like at 30,000 feet. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. The morning sun blazed across Ramstein Air Base in southwestern Germany, casting long shadows between the aircraft hangars where Captain Constance Garcia performed her daily ritual of invisible excellence. At 26, she stood barely 5'4" with dark hair pulled back in regulation style, her Spanish accent still detectable despite 5 years in the U.S. Air Force. While other pilots grabbed coffee and discussed weekend plans, Constance was already in Hangar 7, running her hands along the titanium armor of her A-10 Thunderbolt II. The Warthog, as pilots affectionately call the tank-killing aircraft, was considered an ugly duckling among the sleek fighters that dominated military aviation. Its twin engines mounted high on the fuselage, its massive 30mm cannon, and its ungainly appearance made it the subject of jokes among pilots who flew faster, more glamorous aircraft. But Constance saw something different in the A-10's brutal functionality. She saw a machine built for purpose over prestige, designed to save ground troops rather than win air-to-air dogfights. Her fellow pilots at Ramstein knew her as the maintenance officer who could diagnose engine problems by sound alone, who understood the A-10 systems better than mechanics with twice her experience. What they didn't know was that Constance had logged more simulator hours than any pilot on the base, studying combat scenarios that she'd never been assigned to fly. Every night after her official duties ended, she remained in the flight training center, running through close air support missions, practicing emergency procedures, and memorizing the radio frequencies of every ground unit in the European theater. The dismissive culture at Ramstein wasn't overtly hostile, but it was suffocating in its subtle exclusions. During mission briefings, Constance sat in the back corner, her tactical suggestions politely acknowledged and promptly ignored. When combat assignments were handed out, she was invariably assigned to training flights, equipment transfers, or routine patrols that kept her safely away from anything that might involve actual combat. Colonel Morrison had made his position clear during her initial evaluation. "Garcia, you're technically proficient, but combat aviation requires split-second decisions without emotional interference. We need pilots who can compartmentalize, who won't hesitate when lives are on the line." The subtext was unmistakable. Her Spanish heritage, her passionate personality, and her tendency to advocate fiercely for her positions marked her as too emotional for combat situations. The irony wasn't lost on Constance. She'd grown up in Barcelona, where her father worked as an air traffic controller and her mother served as a flight instructor. Aviation wasn't just her career, it was her heritage. She learned to fly before she could legally drive, had competed in aerobatic competitions throughout Europe, and had immigrated to the United States specifically to join what she considered the world's finest air force. Yet here she was, relegated to maintenance duties and training flights, while less experienced pilots flew the missions she had dreamed of since childhood. Her technical knowledge was undeniable. Constance could calculate fuel consumption rates, ordnance loads, and approach angles faster than most pilots could input them into their flight computers. She understood the A-10's capabilities and limitations with an intimacy that bordered on obsession. But technical knowledge, her superiors reminded her, wasn't the same as combat readiness. Combat required a different kind of thinking, a coolness under pressure that they weren't convinced she possessed. The other pilots respected her expertise, but saw her as a support player rather than a frontline combatant. Captain Williams, who had arrived at Ramstein 6 months after Constance, but had already flown 3 combat missions, often sought her advice on technical matters. "Hey Garcia, what's the optimal altitude for GAU-8 effectiveness against hardened targets?" he'd ask. then take her detailed analysis and apply it to missions she wasn't cleared to fly. The culture of exclusion at Ramstein was built on layers of unspoken assumptions that had calcified into institutional doctrine. During weekly pilot meetings, Constance watched as mission assignments were distributed based on what Colonel Morrison called operational readiness assessments. These assessments, ostensibly objective evaluations of pilot capabilities, consistently ranked Constance near the bottom despite her superior technical scores and flight proficiency ratings. The assessment criteria included categories like emotional stability under stress, decision-making in ambiguous situations, and leadership potential in combat scenarios. Constance's scores in these subjective areas were consistently marked down with comments like tends to overanalyze tactical situations and may struggle with the psychological demands of combat missions. The fact that she'd never been given an opportunity to demonstrate her capabilities in actual combat situations made these assessments particularly frustrating. Major Hendricks, Morrison's deputy commander, had been more direct during a private evaluation session 3 months earlier. "Garcia, you are passionate about flying, and that's commendable, but passion can become a liability when you're making life or death decisions. We've observed that you tend to become emotionally invested in mission outcomes, which can cloud judgment. Combat pilots need to maintain objectivity even when friendly forces are taking casualties." The accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth wrapped in discriminatory logic. Constance did care deeply about mission outcomes, did feel personally responsible for the safety of ground troops, and did spend sleepless nights reviewing after-action reports from missions she hadn't flown. But rather than viewing this investment as dedication, her superiors saw it as emotional instability. The informal pilot culture reinforced these official assessments. During downtime in the squadron ready room, conversation often turned to combat experiences that Constance couldn't share. Stories of close air support missions, of providing cover for troops under fire, of making split-second decisions that saved lives. She listened to these conversations with the hunger of someone who understood the technical challenges being described, but had never experienced the emotional reality of combat aviation. Captain Rodriguez, who joined the squadron only 8 months earlier, had already become something of a legend for his performance during a recent mission over Syria. "The JTAC was screaming for immediate support," he recounted to a circle of attentive pilots. "Friendlies were pinned down by a machine gun nest, and I had maybe 30 seconds to acquire the target before they'd be overrun. No time for multiple passes, no time for detailed target verification. Just point, shoot, and pray you got the right coordinates." These stories reinforced the narrative that combat aviation required a particular type of personality, one that could make instantaneous decisions without being paralyzed by the potential consequences of error. Constance's detailed planning, her tendency to consider multiple scenarios, and her insistence on thorough mission preparation were framed as evidence that she lacked the decisive nature required for combat operations. The exclusion extended beyond official assignments to informal mentoring relationships. Senior pilots routinely took junior male officers under their wings, sharing tactical knowledge and providing guidance for career advancement. Constance found herself outside these networks, her questions answered politely, but without the depth of engagement that might have accelerated her development as a combat pilot. Even her technical expertise became a double-edged sword. While other pilots valued her knowledge, they also used it to reinforce her role as a support specialist rather than a combatant. "Garcia knows more about A-10 systems than anyone on the base," was a common refrain, usually followed by assignments that utilized her knowledge in maintenance or training roles rather than operational missions. The psychological impact of this sustained exclusion was profound. Constance began to question whether her superiors might be right, whether her emotional investment in mission outcomes might indeed compromise her effectiveness in combat situations. She found herself analyzing her own reactions, wondering if her passion for aviation was being correctly interpreted as a liability rather than an asset. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. What Colonel Morrison and the other pilots at Ramstein didn't know was that Constance Garcia had been conducting her own advanced combat training program for over 18 months. Every evening after official duties ended, when the base settled into its quiet nighttime rhythm, she remained in the Flight Simulation Center, running through scenarios that went far beyond her authorized training requirements. The simulator bay held 6 stations, but after 2,100 hours, it was typically empty except for scheduled maintenance. Constance had cultivated a relationship with Technical Sergeant Murphy, the simulation technician who appreciated her genuine interest in system capabilities and her willingness to help troubleshoot software glitches. In exchange for her technical assistance, Murphy allowed her access to advanced combat scenarios normally reserved for pilots with active combat clearances. These weren't routine training exercises. Constance programmed complex, multi-threat environments that replicated the most challenging conditions documented in recent combat reports. She studied after-action reviews from A-10 missions in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, identifying the tactical decisions that separated successful missions from catastrophic failures. Each scenario she created pushed her capabilities further, forcing her to make the split-second decisions that her superiors claimed she couldn't handle. The simulations revealed capabilities that even Constance hadn't fully recognized in herself. Under pressure, her Spanish temperament transformed from the perceived liability that Morrison described into a fierce focus that enhanced rather than compromised her decision-making. When simulated ground troops called for immediate close air support, she found herself processing multiple data streams simultaneously, calculating approach angles, ordnance selection, and friendly force positions with an intuitive speed that surprised her. She developed techniques for managing the emotional intensity of combat situations that her instructors had never taught. Drawing on meditation practices she'd learned from her mother, a former yoga instructor, Constance learned to maintain tactical awareness while compartmentalizing the emotional weight of her decisions. The key wasn't eliminating emotion, as her superiors suggested, but channeling it into enhanced situational awareness and protective urgency for ground forces. Her technical preparation extended beyond simulation training. Constance had memorized the radio frequencies, call signs, and standard operating procedures for every ground unit in the European theater. She studied satellite imagery of potential combat zones, learning terrain features that might affect approach routes or target identification. Her quarters contained detailed maps marked with elevation data, population centers, and infrastructure that could influence tactical decisions. The most sophisticated element of her preparation involved studying enemy tactics and capabilities. Using open-source intelligence and declassified reports, Constance had compiled detailed profiles of anti-aircraft systems, insurgent movement patterns, and typical ambush techniques used in current conflict zones. She understood the capabilities and limitations of potential threats better than pilots who'd actually encountered them in combat. Her language skills provided another hidden advantage. Beyond her native Spanish and fluent English, Constance had maintained conversational skills in French and German from her European education and had recently begun studying Arabic through online courses. She understood that effective close air support often required communication with multinational ground forces, and language barriers could mean the difference between successful coordination and friendly fire incidents. The psychological preparation was perhaps most important. Constance had researched combat stress reactions, post-traumatic stress symptoms, and decision-making under extreme pressure. She developed mental frameworks for processing traumatic experiences that might occur during combat missions, recognizing that emotional resilience required preparation rather than suppression. Her physical training went beyond Air Force requirements. Constance maintained a conditioning program designed specifically for the physical demands of combat flying. G-force tolerance, extended mission endurance, and the ability to function effectively after sleep deprivation. She'd studied the physiological demands that combat pilots faced and tailored her fitness regimen accordingly. The most challenging aspect of her preparation was maintaining absolute secrecy.
None of her colleagues knew about the extensive simulation training, the tactical studies, or the comprehensive preparation that consumed her off-duty hours. She understood that revealing her activities would likely result in disciplinary action for exceeding her authorized training scope, or worse, confirmation of Morrison's belief that she was emotionally obsessed with combat missions.
July 15th began as another routine summer day at Ramstein, with clear skies and the familiar rhythm of training flights and maintenance operations. Constance was in Hangar 7, reviewing maintenance logs for her A-10, when the base-wide alert system shattered the morning calm with its urgent electronic wail. The sound sent every person on the flight line into immediate action, a conditioned response to the signal that meant operational emergency. Within minutes, the base communication system crackled with fragmentary reports that painted a picture of developing catastrophe. A joint European training exercise in the mountainous region near the Czech border had gone catastrophically wrong. What was supposed to be a routine multinational coordination drill had evolved into a real-world crisis when a mechanical failure caused a transport helicopter to crash land in hostile territory. The initial reports were chaotic and incomplete, filtered through multiple command structures and translated between languages as information flowed from Czech ground controllers to German command centers to American operational headquarters. Constance found herself drawn toward the Wing Command Center, where she could overhear radio communications as duty officers struggled to piece together the situation. The crashed helicopter contained 12 personnel from 4 different NATO countries: American Special Operations Advisors, German logistics specialists, French intelligence officers, and Czech liaison personnel. They'd been conducting what military planners called a confidence-building exercise designed to improve cooperation between Allied forces. Now they were stranded in territory controlled by hostile forces with limited ammunition, no heavy weapons, and injured personnel who couldn't be moved quickly. Colonel Morrison's voice dominated the command center as he coordinated the emerging rescue operation. The geography complicated every potential response. The crash site was located in a narrow valley surrounded by steep ridges, accessible only through a mountain pass that hostile forces had already begun to monitor. Conventional helicopters couldn't approach without exposing themselves to anti-aircraft fire, and ground-based rescue forces would require hours to reach the location. The weather conditions were deteriorating rapidly. Afternoon thunderstorms were building over the mountains, creating visibility problems and dangerous flying conditions that would ground most aircraft within hours. The window for any rescue operation was closing fast, and traditional approaches seemed increasingly impossible. The trapped personnel had established radio contact, but their situation was desperate. The helicopter's emergency beacon indicated their precise location, but it also meant that hostile forces were homing in on their position. They estimated having perhaps 2 hours before being overrun, and several team members required immediate medical evacuation. Morrison's initial response followed standard protocols. He contacted German military commanders to coordinate helicopter assets, reached out to Czech authorities for ground-based support, and began preparing conventional rescue aircraft. But each potential solution encountered insurmountable obstacles. German helicopters were committed to other operations. Czech ground forces were too far away, and weather conditions were grounding most aircraft. As reports continued flowing into the command center, the scope of the crisis became clear. This wasn't just a rescue operation, it was a potential international incident that could damage NATO relations and compromise ongoing security operations. The personnel stranded in that valley included individuals with classified knowledge that couldn't be allowed to fall into hostile hands. The pressure on Morrison was enormous. His decisions would be scrutinized by commanders in 4 different countries, and failure could end careers and compromise strategic relationships. But the traditional tools at his disposal seemed inadequate for the unique challenges of this situation. Constance listened to the unfolding crisis from the periphery of the command center, her mind automatically analyzing the tactical situation. She recognized the geographic constraints, understood the weather limitations, and began calculating approach routes that might work where conventional solutions failed. But she also knew that her input wouldn't be welcomed in the high-stakes environment of the command center. The clock was ticking, and every minute of delay reduced the chances of a successful rescue operation.
The first rescue attempt launched at 13:47 hours, exactly 2 hours and 15 minutes after the initial crash report. Colonel Morrison had assembled what appeared to be an overwhelming force. 2 CH-47 Chinook helicopters, escorted by a pair of Apache attack helicopters, supported by electronic warfare aircraft and a command and control platform orbiting at safe distance. It represented the textbook approach to combat search and rescue, executed by experienced crews with proven capabilities. The mission lasted exactly 17 minutes before hostile fire forced a complete withdrawal. The Apache pilots reported multiple surface-to-air missile launches, heavy machine gun positions along the ridgelines, and coordinated anti-aircraft fire that made approach to the crash site impossible. The Chinook helicopters never got within 5 kilometers of the stranded personnel before aborting their approach under intense fire. Captain Williams, piloting the lead Apache, provided a grim assessment over the radio. "Command, this is Apache lead. Valley approach is completely compromised. Multiple AAA positions, at least 3 SAM sites, and coordinated defensive fire. Recommend alternate extraction route or significant suppression assets before another attempt." The second attempt, launched 30 minutes later, focused on the eastern approach route that intelligence analysts believed might be less heavily defended. This mission included additional electronic warfare support and preliminary strikes against identified anti-aircraft positions. It lasted 23 minutes before radio intercepts indicated that hostile forces had repositioned to counter the new approach route. Major Hendricks, coordinating the rescue efforts, reported increasing frustration to Colonel Morrison. "Sir, they're adapting faster than we can adjust our approach. Every route we attempt, they're repositioning assets to counter. It's like they have advance warning of our intentions." The third attempt represented Morrison's most aggressive option. Fighter aircraft conducted preliminary strikes against suspected anti-aircraft positions, while a special operations team attempted to infiltrate the area on foot. But the mountain terrain that protected the crash site from easy access also prevented effective close air support for the infiltrating team. Within an hour, the Special Operations Commander requested extraction for his own forces, reporting that the approach route was too heavily defended for a dismounted assault. By 16:30 hours, Morrison had exhausted his conventional options. 3 separate rescue attempts had failed, and the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Weather conditions were worsening as predicted, with thunderstorms building over the mountains and visibility dropping below minimums for most aircraft operations. The trapped personnel reported increasing hostile activity around their position, and several injured team members required immediate medical attention. The international pressure was intensifying as well. German command was questioning American rescue capabilities, French officials were demanding immediate action for their personnel, and Czech authorities were considering unilateral ground operations that could compromise the entire situation. Morrison found himself caught between operational limitations and political demands that seemed impossible to reconcile. During an emergency briefing at 16:45 hours, Morrison's staff presented increasingly desperate alternatives. Some suggested waiting for improved weather conditions, though the trapped personnel might not survive another night. Others recommended a ground assault, with heavy casualties expected on both sides. The most extreme option involved declaring the personnel lost and focusing on damage control to prevent classified information from being compromised. Technical Sergeant Murphy, monitoring communications from the Flight Operations Center, approached Constance as she watched the failed rescue attempts from the maintenance hangar. "Captain Garcia," he said quietly, "I've been listening to the tactical frequencies. They're not considering low-level approaches because of the AAA threat, but your bird could make that run." Constance understood immediately what Murphy meant. The A-10 Thunderbolt II was specifically designed for low-level operations in heavily defended airspace. Its titanium armor could withstand small arms fire and light anti-aircraft weapons that would destroy other aircraft.
More importantly, its low-speed characteristics and exceptional maneuverability made it capable of precision operations in confined spaces where faster aircraft couldn't operate effectively. She'd studied this exact scenario in her simulation training, had practiced low-level penetration of defended airspace and precision weapons delivery in mountainous terrain. The A-10's capabilities were perfectly matched to the tactical situation, but Morrison would never consider sending her on such a mission. The irony was devastating. While conventional aircraft failed repeatedly, the solution sat in Hangar 7, fully fueled and equipped, piloted by someone who'd trained extensively for exactly this situation. But the same institutional barriers that had excluded Constance from routine missions now prevented her from attempting a rescue that she believed was not only possible, but probable.
At 17:02 hours, with storm clouds building ominously over the mountains and the trapped personnel reporting hostile forces closing to within 200 meters of their position, Colonel Morrison made the announcement that would change everything. Standing in the center of the command center, surrounded by failed mission planning and increasingly desperate alternatives, he keyed his radio with visible frustration. "All available aircraft, this is Wing Command." Morrison's voice carried the weight of a commander facing impossible choices. "I need any pilot, any aircraft capable of close air support in mountainous terrain. Weather window is closing in 30 minutes. Any jet will do if you can make the approach these helicopters can't." The radio fell silent for nearly 15 seconds. Morrison's request was unprecedented, a break from standard protocol that reflected his growing desperation. Around the command center, duty officers exchanged uncertain glances. The colonel had essentially opened the mission to anyone willing to attempt what specialized rescue aircraft couldn't accomplish. Constance Garcia stood in the doorway of the command center, having arrived just moments before Morrison's announcement. She'd come to volunteer her services, knowing the offer would be rejected, but unable to watch fellow service members die while she possessed the capabilities that might save them. Morrison's desperate call changed the equation entirely. "Sir?" Constance said, her voice clear despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "Captain Garcia requesting permission to attempt the rescue mission. My A-10's fueled and armed, ready for immediate departure." The command center fell absolutely silent. Every head turned toward Constance, most displaying expressions ranging from disbelief to pity. Morrison's face cycled through confusion, recognition, and growing anger as he processed what she'd just proposed. "Garcia?" Morrison's voice was dangerously quiet. "You're not qualified for combat search and rescue operations. You've never flown a combat mission, never operated in defended airspace, never conducted close air support for troops in contact. This is not a training exercise." "Sir, I understand the risks, but I also understand the A-10's capabilities better than anyone on this base. My aircraft can operate at altitudes and speeds that make it viable for this mission where other platforms have failed." Major Hendricks interjected sharply. "Captain, you are talking about flying into the most heavily defended airspace we've encountered in years. We've lost 3 separate rescue attempts. This isn't about aircraft capabilities, it's about pilot experience under fire." The familiar burn of dismissal filled Constance, but this time the stakes transcended her personal frustration. 12 people were going to die in the next hour unless someone attempted an unconventional solution. Her months of preparation, her extensive simulation training, her deep understanding of the A-10 systems, all of it came down to this moment. "Sir," she said, her voice gaining strength, "I've studied every failed rescue attempt today. The problem isn't pilot courage or aircraft speed. It's altitude and approach route. Helicopters and fast movers have to maintain altitudes that expose them to SAM systems. The A-10 can penetrate at 200 feet below their engagement envelope and provide precision fire support that creates an extraction window." Morrison's expression shifted from anger towards something approaching consideration, but Captain Williams cut off any potential discussion. "Garcia, you're talking about flying into the most heavily defended airspace we've encountered in years. We've lost 3 separate rescue attempts.
This isn't about aircraft capabilities, it's about pilot experience under fire." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Constance looked around the command center at faces filled with doubt and dismissal, at officers who'd spent 2 years convincing her that she wasn't ready for exactly this situation. But she also saw the tactical display showing the location of 12 stranded personnel who would be overrun in less than an hour. "Sir," Constance said, addressing Morrison directly, "you said any pilot, any aircraft. I'm volunteering. My A-10 is the only platform on this base specifically designed for this mission profile. Give me 30 minutes and I'll bring them home."
Colonel Morrison stared at Constance for what felt like an eternity, his jaw working as he processed the impossible choice before him. Around the command center, duty officers held their breath, understanding that they were witnessing a moment that would define careers and potentially save or doom 12 lives. The tactical display continued its relentless countdown. Hostile forces were now within 150 meters of the crash site. "Garcia," Morrison finally said, his voice heavy with the weight of command decisions, "you're asking me to send an untested pilot into the most dangerous mission we've attempted today. If you fail, I lose you and any chance of future rescue attempts. If you succeed—" He paused, clearly struggling with implications he'd never considered. "If you succeed, it means I've been wrong about your capabilities for 2 years." Constance felt the moment crystallizing around her. Every assumption, every dismissal, every exclusion from meaningful missions had led to this point. She could accept Morrison's decision and watch 12 people die while knowing she might have saved them, or she could force a confrontation that would either vindicate her years of preparation or end her military career. "Sir," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing, "you don't have to authorize the mission. You said any pilot, any aircraft. I'm informing you that I'm taking off in 5 minutes. Court-martial me afterward if you want, but those people are going to die if someone doesn't try." The command center erupted in shocked murmurs. Major Hendricks stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "Captain Garcia, you're talking about direct insubordination. You can't simply commandeer an aircraft and launch an unauthorized mission." But Morrison raised his hand for silence, his eyes never leaving Constance's face. She could see him calculating risks, political consequences, and military necessities. The weight of command had isolated him in a decision that would be scrutinized by superiors in 4 different countries. "Tech Sergeant Murphy," Morrison called without turning around, "what's the current status of Captain Garcia's A-10? Murphy's voice came from the back of the room, clear and professional. "Sir, aircraft is fully fueled, armed with standard close air support ordnance, and cleared for immediate departure. All systems green." Morrison nodded slowly, then walked to the tactical display showing the crash site. The red dot representing the stranded personnel seemed to pulse with urgency as weather data showed the approaching storm system. When he turned back to Constance, his expression had shifted from resistance towards something resembling desperate calculation. "Garcia, I'm not authorizing this mission, but I'm also not stopping you from taking off. You have 30 minutes before weather conditions ground all aircraft. If you're going to do this insane thing, you'd better be in the air in 5 minutes." The distinction was crucial. Morrison was providing just enough plausible deniability to protect himself from charges of reckless endangerment while giving Constance the opening she needed. It wasn't authorization, but it wasn't prohibition either. Constance felt the moment crystallizing around her. Every assumption, every dismissal, every exclusion from meaningful missions had led to this point. She could accept Morrison's decision and watch 12 people die while knowing she might have saved them, or she could force a confrontation that would either vindicate her years of preparation or end her military career. "Sir," she said, already moving toward the door, "I'll bring them home." As she ran toward Hangar 7, she could hear Morrison's voice behind her, addressing the command center. "All units, be advised we have an unauthorized aircraft attempting rescue operations. Monitor tactical frequencies and prepare for emergency medical support upon return." The hangar was empty except for Technical Sergeant Murphy,
who was already conducting final systems checks on her A-10. "Captain," he said without looking up from his checklist, "I took the liberty of configuring your ordnance for close air support. AGM-65 Mavericks for hardened targets, 30mm ammunition for suppression, and countermeasures loaded." Constance realized that Murphy had been preparing for this moment just as she had, understanding that her unauthorized training might eventually be needed. As she climbed into the cockpit, he handed her a radio frequency card with tactical channels for the stranded personnel. "Ma'am," Murphy said quietly, "show them what the A-10 can do." The engines spun up with their characteristic whine, and Constance ran through her pre-flight checklist with mechanical precision. Her hands moved automatically through procedures she had practiced thousands of times, but her mind was focused on the tactical situation ahead. Low-level penetration, precision strikes against defensive positions, and coordination with ground forces under fire. As she taxied toward the runway, her radio crackled with Morrison's final communication. "Garcia, you're cleared for takeoff. Bring our people home." The A-10 lifted into the afternoon sky, carrying Constance toward a confrontation that would prove definitively whether she belonged in combat aviation or whether her superiors had been right to exclude her from missions that mattered.
Flying at 200 feet above the German countryside, Constance Garcia felt the A-10 respond to her touch like an extension of her own nervous system. The aircraft's twin engines provided a reassuring rumble as she navigated toward the Czech border, her flight path carefully planned to avoid commercial air corridors and minimize radar exposure. Every simulation she'd run, every tactical scenario she'd studied had prepared her for this moment. The weather was deteriorating rapidly as predicted. Dark clouds built over the mountains ahead, and visibility was dropping toward minimums that would ground most aircraft. But the A-10 was designed for low-visibility operations, and Constance had trained extensively in challenging weather conditions. The approaching storm would actually provide cover for her penetration of defended airspace. 20 kilometers from the target area, she established radio contact with the stranded personnel. "Rescue team, this is Warthog 1. I'm approaching your position for immediate extraction support. Transmit your current status and defensive positions." The response came immediately, filled with static and the sound of small arms fire in the background. "Warthog 1, this is Rescue Team Leader. We have 12 personnel, 4 wounded, hostiles within 100 meters and closing. Multiple machine gun positions on ridgelines north and east of our position. We're running low on ammunition." Constance acknowledged the transmission while studying her tactical display. The geography was exactly as she'd memorized from satellite imagery, but seeing it firsthand revealed details that would be crucial for her approach. The valley was narrow and deep, surrounded by ridges that provided perfect positions for anti-aircraft weapons. Traditional aircraft would have to expose themselves to coordinated fire from multiple directions. But the A-10's capabilities were specifically designed for this environment. Its low-speed characteristics allowed precision maneuvering in confined spaces, while its titanium armor could withstand small arms and light anti-aircraft fire that had forced other aircraft to abort their rescue attempts. "Rescue team, I'm beginning my attack run against defensive positions. Mark your location with smoke and keep your heads down. Danger close fire mission in 30 seconds. Constance dropped to 150 feet and began her approach through the mountain pass, her speed reduced to just above stall threshold to maximize accuracy and minimize exposure time. The first anti-aircraft position opened fire as she entered the valley, tracers streaking past her canopy, but she maintained her approach vector with mechanical precision. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon responded with its distinctive roar, sending 30mm depleted uranium rounds into the machine gun nest with devastating accuracy. The position disappeared in a cloud of debris and smoke, eliminating the primary threat to helicopter extraction. But Constance knew that success required neutralizing multiple defensive positions before rescue aircraft could safely approach. Banking hard to the left, she identified the second threat position based on muzzle flashes and radio intercepts. This target was more challenging, positioned on a reverse slope that required a nearly vertical attack angle.
Constance rolled the A-10 into a steep dive, fighting through ground fire that rattled against her aircraft's armor and released 2 AGM-65 Maverick missiles with surgical precision. The explosions echoed through the valley as the second defensive position was eliminated, but Constance knew that the most dangerous threats were still active. Surface-to-air missile systems were repositioning to engage her, and she had perhaps 2 minutes before they achieved firing solutions. Rescue team, defensive positions neutralized on ridgelines. Extract to helicopter landing zone immediately. Cavalry is en route. As if summoned by her words, the familiar sound of helicopter rotors echoed through the valley. The rescue aircraft that had been forced to abort earlier attempts were now approaching under cover of Constance's suppression mission. Her gamble was working, but the most dangerous phase was just beginning. The SAM system activated as the rescue helicopters entered the valley, and Constance found herself in a deadly game of three-dimensional chess. She had to maintain suppression fire against remaining defensive positions while protecting the helicopters from missile attack, all while operating in a confined space that limited her maneuvering options. Training took over as Constance executed techniques she'd practiced hundreds of times in simulation. Chaff and flare dispensers created electronic confusion for incoming missiles while she maneuvered to position herself between the threats and the rescue aircraft. The A-10's legendary survivability was being tested under the most demanding conditions possible. Warthog 1, this is Rescue Lead. We're taking fire from the eastern ridge. Can you suppress? Constance was already maneuvering toward the threat, her cannon tracking toward muzzle flashes barely visible through the gathering storm clouds. The 30mm rounds found their target with devastating effect, silencing the last major defensive position and creating the window the rescue aircraft needed. 12 minutes after entering the valley, she watched the rescue aircraft lift off with all 12 personnel aboard, including the wounded, who would receive immediate medical attention. Her unauthorized mission had succeeded where 3 conventional rescue attempts had failed. As she escorted the helicopters out of the danger zone, Constance allowed herself the first moment of satisfaction she'd felt in months. Every assumption about her capabilities, every exclusion from meaningful missions, every suggestion that she wasn't ready for combat aviation had been proven wrong in the most dramatic way possible. The flight back to Ramstein would give her time to process what just happened and prepare for the consequences that would inevitably follow.
The Ramstein Air Base control tower had never experienced anything quite like the scene that unfolded as Constance Garcia's A-10 appeared through the storm clouds, escorted by the rescue helicopters carrying 12 saved lives. Emergency vehicles lined the runway, medical personnel stood ready with stretchers, and what seemed like the entire base population had gathered to witness the return of a mission that everyone had expected to fail. Colonel Morrison stood on the flight line, his radio pressed to his ear as he coordinated the arrival procedures, but his eyes remained fixed on the approaching aircraft. The unauthorized mission that he'd neither approved nor prevented had succeeded in ways that challenged every assumption about pilot capabilities and mission planning that had guided his command decisions for decades. As the helicopters touched down first, their rotors creating swirling clouds of dust and debris, medical teams rushed forward to extract the wounded personnel. The sight of 12 people walking or being carried to safety provided immediate vindication for Constance's unprecedented decision to launch an unauthorized rescue mission. Every life saved represented a calculation that conventional wisdom had deemed impossible. Constance's A-10 touched down 3 minutes later, its landing gear absorbing the impact with characteristic precision. As she taxied toward the parking area, she could see the crowd that had gathered, faces filled with expressions ranging from disbelief to admiration. The small aircraft that military aviation culture had dismissed as an unglamorous support platform had just accomplished what sophisticated rescue helicopters and advanced fighter aircraft couldn't achieve. Technical Sergeant Murphy was the first person to reach her aircraft as she shut down the engines. His grin was visible even through the gathering darkness as he conducted his post-flight inspection, documenting the battle damage that told the story of her penetration into heavily defended airspace. "Captain," he said as she climbed down from the cockpit. "Your bird took some hits, but she brought you home." The crowd parted as Colonel Morrison approached, his expression unreadable in the dim light of the flight line. Constance straightened to attention, preparing for the consequences of her unauthorized action, but Morrison's first words surprised her. "Garcia, report, mission status and personnel accountability." "Sir," Constance replied, her voice steady despite her exhaustion, "all 12 personnel extracted successfully. 4 wounded individuals are receiving medical attention. No friendly casualties during the rescue operation. Aircraft sustained minor battle damage but remained mission-capable throughout the engagement." Morrison nodded slowly, then asked the question that everyone wanted answered. "Captain, how did you accomplish what 3 separate rescue attempts couldn't achieve?" Constance had prepared for this moment during the flight back to base, understanding that her answer would determine not just her own future, but potentially influence military aviation doctrine for years to come. "Sir, the A-10's capabilities were specifically designed for this mission profile: low-altitude penetration, precision weapons delivery in confined spaces, and survivability in defended airspace. The aircraft performed exactly as designed." "And the pilot?" Morrison asked pointedly. "How did an officer with no combat experience execute a mission that experienced combat pilots couldn't accomplish?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, but Constance understood that it also represented an opportunity to address the institutional assumptions that had excluded her from meaningful missions. "Sir, I prepared for this type of operation through extensive simulation training, tactical study, and systems familiarization. When the situation required capabilities that matched my preparation, I was ready to execute." Major Hendricks stepped forward, his tone challenging. "Garcia, you're saying that simulation training prepared you for live combat better than actual combat experience prepared other pilots?" "No, sir. I'm saying that the right aircraft, flown by someone who understood its capabilities, could accomplish this specific mission when conventional approaches failed. The A-10 is designed for exactly this type of operation." Captain Williams, who had participated in the failed rescue attempts, approached with a mixture of respect and bewilderment. "Garcia, I have to ask, when you were taking fire in that valley, when missiles were launching at you, how did you maintain focus? That level of stress breaks down most pilots on their first combat mission." Constance considered her answer carefully, understanding that her response would be scrutinized for evidence of the emotional instability that her superiors had long suspected. "Sir, the stress clarified my focus rather than compromising it. Every procedure I'd practiced, every scenario I'd studied, became automatic. The emotional intensity enhanced my situational awareness rather than degrading it." The crowd around them had grown silent, understanding that they were witnessing a conversation that would influence military aviation culture far beyond Ramstein Air Base. Morrison's next question would determine whether Constance's success was treated as an exceptional circumstance or as evidence of systematic misjudgment in pilot evaluation processes. "Garcia," Morrison said finally, his voice carrying the weight of command authority, "you disobeyed orders, violated flight protocols, and launched an unauthorized combat mission. Under normal circumstances, you'd be facing court-martial proceedings." Constance felt her stomach drop, but Morrison continued. "However, your actions saved 12 lives and demonstrated capabilities that we clearly failed to recognize. The question now is whether your success justifies the means you used to achieve it. The answer to that question would reshape everything about how the Air Force evaluated pilot potential and assigned combat missions."
The inquiry began at 0800 hours the following morning in the base conference room that had been hastily converted into a formal hearing chamber. 3 colonels from European Command sat behind a polished table, their faces stern with the gravity of investigating an unauthorized combat mission that had saved 12 lives while potentially violating numerous military regulations. Colonel Morrison sat to one side,
his position as wing commander making him both witness and potential co-defendant in proceedings that could reshape military aviation doctrine. The success of Constance's mission had created a paradox that military legal systems struggled to address. How do you prosecute someone for insubordination when their actions achieved what authorized operations couldn't accomplish? Constance entered the room in dress uniform, her ribbons and insignia reflecting 2 years of exemplary service that had been overshadowed by perceptions about her emotional suitability for combat operations. She took her seat at the defendant's table, flanked by a military attorney who seemed overwhelmed by the complexity of the case. Colonel Richardson, serving as the presiding officer, opened the proceedings with a statement that captured the unprecedented nature of the situation. Captain Garcia, you stand accused of unauthorized use of military aircraft, violation of flight safety protocols, and direct insubordination of lawful orders. However, the circumstances surrounding these actions raise questions about military doctrine, pilot evaluation procedures, and the balance between individual initiative and command authority. The first phase of the inquiry focused on establishing the facts of Constance's unauthorized mission. Flight recorder data, radio communications, and witness testimony painted a detailed picture of her penetration into defended airspace and successful extraction of stranded personnel. The technical evidence was unambiguous. She had accomplished a mission that conventional wisdom deemed impossible. Major Hendricks testified about the failed rescue attempts that preceded Constance's mission, his account highlighting the limitations that had forced experienced pilots to abort their operations. The defensive environment was unlike anything we'd encountered in recent operations, he explained. Coordinated anti-aircraft fire, repositioning missile systems, and terrain that limited our tactical options. When asked why the A-10 succeeded where other aircraft failed, Hendricks admitted reluctantly, the A-10's low-speed characteristics and armor protection allowed it to operate in an environment that would have been lethal for other platforms. Captain Garcia exploited capabilities that we hadn't fully considered. The second phase examined Constance's qualifications and preparation for the mission she'd undertaken. Technical Sergeant Murphy testified about her extensive simulation training, revealing the scope of preparation that none of her superiors had known about. Captain Garcia logged more simulator hours than most pilots with active combat clearances, Murphy explained. She studied scenarios that matched exactly what she encountered during the rescue mission. Captain Williams provided perhaps the most damaging testimony about institutional assumptions that had shaped Constance's career. We all believed that combat aviation required a specific personality type. Captain Garcia's passionate commitment to mission success was interpreted as emotional instability rather than dedication. We may have confused intensity with instability. The third phase addressed the broader implications of Constance's actions for military discipline and command authority. Colonel Morrison testified about the impossible choice he'd faced: authorize a mission by an unqualified pilot or watch 12 people die while qualified pilots remained grounded by tactical limitations. Constance forced a decision that military doctrine doesn't adequately address, Morrison explained. She had the capabilities necessary for mission success, but not the official qualifications we typically require. Her actions challenged our understanding of how we evaluate and utilize pilot potential. The most compelling testimony came from the rescued personnel themselves. Staff Sergeant Martinez, one of the wounded soldiers extracted from the crash site, described the final moments before Constance's arrival. We could hear hostile forces moving toward our position. Radio traffic indicated that all rescue attempts had failed. When we heard that A-10 coming through the valley, it was the most beautiful sound any of us had ever experienced. Colonel Richardson's questions to Constance focused on her decision-making process and understanding of the risks she'd undertaken. Captain, did you consider the possibility that your unauthorized action could result in additional casualties and the loss of a valuable aircraft? Yes, sir, Constance replied.
I calculated those risks against the certainty that 12 people would die without intervention. My assessment was that the mission had a reasonable probability of success based on my preparation and the A-10's capabilities. And if you had failed? Then I would have failed attempting to save lives rather than succeeding at doing nothing, sir. The inquiry recessed for deliberation, leaving Constance to contemplate the possibility that her moment of vindication might also mark the end of her military career. The paradox remained unresolved. How do you maintain military discipline while encouraging the initiative that had just saved 12 lives?
The deliberations lasted 3 hours, during which Colonel Richardson and his fellow officers grappled with precedents that didn't exist and regulations that hadn't anticipated the unique circumstances of Constance's unauthorized mission. During this time, a parallel investigation was quietly taking place as European command officials sought to understand how institutional assumptions had so dramatically miscalculated pilot capabilities. The broader investigation revealed systematic patterns that extended far beyond Constance's individual case. Records showed that female pilots across multiple bases were consistently rated lower in subjective categories like combat readiness and emotional stability under pressure, despite achieving superior scores in technical evaluations and flight proficiency assessments. The documentation painted a picture of institutional bias that had been invisible to those perpetuating it. Captain Rodriguez, who had served alongside Constance for 18 months, was interviewed about the squadron's culture and evaluation processes. His testimony proved particularly revealing. We all knew Garcia was technically superior to most pilots in the unit, but there was this unspoken assumption that technical skill wasn't the same as combat capability. Looking back, I think we confused confidence with competence and unfamiliarity with inability. The investigation team discovered that Constance's extensive simulation training had been conducted without any official oversight or documentation. Technical Sergeant Murphy's records show that she had logged nearly 400 hours of advanced combat scenarios over 18 months, equivalent to the training time typically required for combat certification. The fact that this preparation had gone unrecognized highlighted gaps in how the Air Force tracked and evaluated pilot development. Perhaps most damaging to the institutional credibility was the discovery that Constance's tactical analysis and mission planning capabilities had been consistently overlooked during routine briefings. Major Hendricks admitted during questioning that her suggestions had been dismissed not because they lacked merit, but because they came from someone not officially designated as a combat pilot. The investigation also revealed the extent of Constance's technical expertise. Her maintenance reports showed an understanding of A-10 systems that exceeded many pilots with years of operational experience. Her documentation of aircraft capabilities and limitations had been used informally by other pilots to improve their own mission planning. Yet this expertise had never been formally recognized or incorporated into her evaluations. International pressure added another dimension to the investigation. The successful rescue had involved personnel from 4 NATO countries, and their governments were demanding explanations for why conventional rescue operations had failed while an unauthorized mission succeeded. The political implications forced military leadership to confront uncomfortable questions about doctrine and pilot utilization. Colonel Peterson from the Inspector General's office conducted interviews with the rescued personnel, seeking to understand the tactical situation that had made conventional approaches impossible. Their accounts consistently described defensive capabilities that exceeded intelligence estimates and terrain challenges that highlighted the limitations of traditional rescue platforms. Staff Sergeant Chen, one of the rescued Chinese liaison officers, provided particularly insightful analysis. Captain Garcia's approach was different from the earlier attempts. She used the terrain and weather conditions that had hindered other aircraft as advantages. Her attack profile was precisely calculated for the defensive environment rather than following standard procedures. The investigation's most significant finding involved the simulation training that Constance had conducted without authorization. Analysis of her training scenarios revealed that she had specifically prepared for the exact tactical situation encountered during the rescue mission. Her unauthorized preparation had been more relevant to mission requirements than the official training programs that qualified other pilots for combat operations. Dr. Williams, a military psychologist brought in to evaluate the case, challenged fundamental assumptions about pilot selection criteria. The characteristics that led to Captain Garcia's exclusion from combat missions, emotional investment in outcomes, detailed preparation beyond requirements, and passionate commitment to mission success were actually predictive of superior performance under pressure. The investigation team also examined the decision-making process that had led to Morrison's implicit authorization of Constance's mission. His testimony revealed the impossible position that commanders faced when conventional wisdom conflicted with operational necessity. Captain Garcia forced me to choose between following regulations and saving lives. The fact that she was right doesn't change the fact that she put me in an untenable position. Technical analysis of Constance's mission execution provided objective validation of her capabilities. Flight recorder data showed precision weapons delivery that exceeded standard accuracy requirements, tactical decision-making that adapted effectively to changing threats, and aircraft handling that maximized the A-10's unique capabilities in challenging conditions. The investigation's preliminary findings suggested that institutional assumptions about pilot capabilities had created systematic blind spots in talent identification and utilization. Constance's case wasn't exceptional because of her unique abilities, but those abilities had been consistently overlooked by evaluation processes that prioritized perception over performance. As the formal inquiry reconvened, the weight of evidence had shifted the focus from Constance's unauthorized actions toward the institutional failures that had made those actions necessary. The question was no longer whether she had violated regulations, but whether those regulations had prevented the Air Force from effectively utilizing available capabilities. The broader implications extended beyond individual careers toward fundamental questions about military culture, pilot evaluation procedures, and the balance between following orders and achieving mission success.